What if you were arrested for a crime you didn't commit? Imagine walking home, minding your own business, when suddenly sirens, flashing lights, and cold handcuffs snapping around your wrists. No one listens. No one cares. You're guilty until proven innocent. That's exactly what happened to 15-year-old Jalen Carter, a brilliant student with dreams of becoming a lawyer. But when the system tried to break him, he did the impossible. He fought back and turned the case upside down. Where are you watching from today? Tell us in the comments. If you love inspiring stories, subscribe to Inspiring Stories Told. The soft hum of fluorescent lights flickered above Jalen Carter as he flipped through the pages of his legal textbook, his fingers gliding over the highlighted passages. The library was nearly empty, save for the occasional sound of pages turning and the distant hum of the air conditioning. He glanced at the time, 9:27 p.m. Too late, but he had been so absorbed in preparing for the statewide mock trial competition that he'd lost track of time. Jalen had always known he was destined for something greater. His dream was to be an attorney, a real force in the courtroom, dismantling injustice with nothing but words and undeniable facts. People underestimated him because of his age, but Jalen had something they couldn't ignore, an unshakable will to fight for truth. His mother, Vanessa Carter, was always telling him to be careful, to watch how he walked, how he talked, how he existed in a world that saw his black skin as a threat before they saw him as a person. The law is meant to protect you, she told him once. But that doesn't mean they'll always see you as someone worth protecting. Jalen had rolled his eyes at the time, convinced that things were different now. But as he packed his books into his backpack and left the warmth of the library, he was about to learn just how right she was. The air was crisp, thick with the scent of rain from earlier in the evening. Streetlights cast an eerie glow onto the cracked pavement, their flickering bulbs barely illuminating the quiet streets. Jalen adjusted his backpack, pulling his hoodie over his head to block out the chilly wind. His school was only 15 minutes away from his house, a walk he had taken 100 times without thinking twice. Except tonight was different. As he passed by the corner convenience store, the shattered glass from its front window crunched beneath his sneakers. His steps slowed, his breath catching in his throat. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the wind, barely holding on to the metal frame of the door. The store's neon signs still buzzed weakly, casting a dull red glow over the chaos. A robbery. The sight made his stomach tighten, but Jalen wasn't the type to stick around where he wasn't needed. He kept walking, his head down, his hands tucked into the pocket of his hoodie. Then sirens. Loud. Overpowering. The kind that made your heart skip a beat before you even knew what was happening. Red and blue lights flashed across the pavement, bouncing off store windows, swallowing the street in a dizzying blur. The world around him erupted into chaos. The sound of screeching tires. The slam of car doors flying open. The sharp, barking voice of a cop yelling something that didn't quite register until it was too late. Hands where I can see them. Jalen froze. It happened so fast. A pounding of footsteps. A hand grabbing his hoodie, yanking him back. A knee slamming into his back so hard it forced the air from his lungs. What the hell? He started, but the words never fully escaped his lips before his face hit the pavement. Pain exploded through his cheekbone, his vision blurring from the impact. The ground was wet beneath him, the cold seeping into his skin, mixing with the sting of his scraped palms. His backpack had spilled open, books and papers scattered across the sidewalk. His glasses, the same ones he had worn since he was 10, lay broken near the curb. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I didn't do anything. Jalen gasped, trying to push himself up. A heavier weight pressed down on him, a hand shoving his head into the pavement. Shut up. Officer Bradley Grayson. Jalen knew that voice. Everyone in the neighborhood did. Grayson was infamous, the kind of cop who liked his job a little too much. The kind who saw every black kid as a suspect before a citizen. Dark hoodie, sneakers, Grayson muttered to his partner. Yeah, that fits. His partner laughed under his breath. You're making a mistake. Jalen tried again, but his voice cracked with desperation. Grayson ignored him, reaching for his radio. "We got him." Jalen felt the cold steel close around his wrists, the handcuffs digging into his skin too tightly, cutting off circulation. A small crowd had begun to gather, people watching, cars slowing down, phones coming out to record. But no one stepped forward. No one stopped this from happening. Fear crawled up Jalen's spine like ice. "Please," he tried again, his voice barely a whisper now. Grayson bent down, close enough for Jalen to smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You know how many kids like you I've locked up?" he murmured, his voice laced with amusement. "Take the plea, Carter. It's easier that way." Jalen's stomach twisted. They weren't going to listen to him. They weren't going to check the cameras. They had already decided he was guilty. The moment the squad car door slammed shut behind him, the truth crashed over him like a wave. His life wasn't his anymore. The inside of the police car reeked of sweat and stale cigarette smoke. Jalen sat stiffly, his wrists still locked behind him, the metal biting into his skin with every small movement. He could hear Grayson and his partner laughing up front, their voices muffled by the glass divider. This wasn't real. This was a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. What would his mother say? The thought of her face, her warm, proud smile when she talked about him becoming a lawyer, made his chest ache. Would she believe him? Would she fight for him? Jalen squeezed his eyes shut, trying to shut out the fear clawing at his throat. He was innocent. That had to count for something, right? But deep down, he already knew the answer. It didn't matter. Not to them. Not to a system that had already decided who he was before he even opened his mouth. Outside, Atlanta kept moving. The lights still shone in the windows of the buildings he passed. The streets were still full of people laughing, talking, living their lives. But inside that car, Jalen was trapped in a different world. One where his future didn't belong to him anymore. Where his dreams of becoming a lawyer meant nothing. Where his innocence wasn't enough. The city didn't stop for Jalen Carter. It never would. And as the station came into view, the flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the cold gray walls, one thought pounded in his skull like a war drum. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. But it was. And the nightmare was only beginning. The squad car rattled as it pulled into the detention center's lot, the metal handcuffs biting deeper into Jalen's wrists. His breath was shaky, uneven. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He had imagined jail before, but only from what he had seen on television, in the news, in history books. But sitting in that squad car, staring out at the looming building ahead, the reality was so much worse. Towering fences wrapped in razor wire cut through the night like barbed shadows. The dull orange glow of flickering streetlights cast eerie silhouettes over the high concrete walls. The place looked less like a detention center and more like a warehouse built to store forgotten people. The doors swung open. "Get out." Officer Bradley Grayson's voice was sharp and patient. Jalen hesitated, his body stiff from the ride, but Grayson yanked him forward. His wrists burned as the cuffs dug deeper, his shoulders aching from the forced position behind his back. Jalen tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words felt stuck in his throat. "You better get comfortable," Grayson muttered as he led Jalen through the doors. "Take the plea, or you'll rot in here." The words sent a chill through Jalen's spine. Rot. Like he wasn't a kid, just a piece of garbage tossed into the system. Jalen clenched his jaw, refusing to show fear. But deep down, fear was all he had left. The moment they stepped inside, the smell hit him first. Sweat. Mold. Urine. Desperation. The walls were lined with boys in jumpsuits, some no older than 13, others closer to 18. Every single one of them looked like they had been chewed up and spit out by the system. Some had hollow eyes, their expressions vacant, like they had already accepted their fate. Others looked angry, their hands balled into fists, muscles tensed. Survival. That's all this place was about. Guards stood along the perimeter, their expressions empty, uninterested. To them, these weren't kids. They were numbers. Statistics. Another case file no one cared about. Jalen was shoved forward. Processing first, one of the officers grunted. They took his shoelaces, like he was some sort of risk to himself. His fingerprints were taken. A mugshot snapped. His name stripped away and replaced with a prison number. He wasn't Jalen Carter, the honor student, anymore. He was just another black boy in the system. And this system didn't care if he was guilty or not. The cell was cold, colder than anything Jalen had ever felt before. There were no blankets, no mattress, just a thin, dirty mat on the floor, barely thick enough to soften the concrete underneath. "That's your spot," the guard said, pointing at the floor like Jalen was a stray dog. Jalen swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't say a word. He sat, curling his knees toward his chest, trying to block out the noise of the place. The yelling, the laughing, the banging on the walls. His stomach twisted in hunger, but his dinner was stolen before he even got a chance to touch it. One of the older inmates, a 17-year-old built like a linebacker, had snatched it off the tray and eaten it right in front of him. "Welcome to hell, rookie," he had sneered, tossing the empty tray to the side. Jalen's stomach groaned in protest, but he knew better than to say anything. At the same time, across the city, Vanessa Carter was fighting with everything she had. She had arrived at the station within an hour of the arrest, her eyes filled with rage and worry, demanding to see her son. "I need to see Jalen. He's just a kid," she shouted. The officers at the front desk barely looked up from their paperwork. "You'll have to wait," one of them muttered, not bothering to hide the amusement in his voice. "Wait? He's my son. He's innocent," she snapped. That made them laugh. "Innocent?" "Yeah, lady, that's what they all say," one of the officers chuckled. Vanessa wanted to scream. Her baby was in there, scared, alone, surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than a criminal. And these officers, the same ones who were supposed to protect and serve, were treating this like a joke. "Let me see him. He's better off pleading guilty," an officer said, shrugging like it was nothing. Vanessa felt her hands shake. They weren't going to help. They didn't care. She felt like she was drowning. Jalen had always been so careful, so smart. He had worked so hard to stay out of trouble. But it didn't matter, did it? Because the moment they saw his skin, they had already made their decision. The next morning, Jalen was pulled from his cell and brought into a small, cold room with a flickering light and a single metal table. A man in a wrinkled suit sat across from him, shuffling through papers like he had already lost interest in the case before it even started. Public Defender Mark Reynolds. Jalen had never met him before, but he already knew what kind of lawyer he was. The kind who took the easy way out. The kind who didn't fight for kids like him. "All right, kid," Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. "Here's the deal. They're offering you a plea. You take it, and you get probation, some community service. No trial." Jalen's stomach turned. "But I didn't do anything." "Yeah, well, that's not how this works," Reynolds said, barely looking at him. "Your word against theirs? A trial could mean years behind bars." Jalen gritted his teeth. "So, you're telling me to say I did something I didn't do?" "I'm telling you," Reynolds said, finally looking at him. "This is the best deal you're gonna get." Jalen's fist curled against the table. This was the system. A machine built to break people like him before they even had a chance to fight back. "No," he said, his voice firm. Reynolds sighed, shaking his head. "You don't want to play hero, kid." I said no. For the first time since this nightmare started, Jalen felt something solid beneath him. He wasn't taking the deal. He wasn't letting them decide his fate. Because if no one else was going to fight for him, he'd fight for himself. Jalen's world has just been ripped apart, and the system is doing everything it can to break him before he even has a chance to fight back. How do you feel watching this happen? Frustrated? Angry? Helpless? That's exactly how they want him to feel. But Jalen isn't giving up, and neither should we. If you believe in justice, if you believe Jalen deserves a fair fight, show your support by liking this video. Your engagement helps spread awareness. Keep watching, because Jalen's battle is far from over. Will he survive this injustice, or will the system crush him first? The air inside the courtroom was thick with judgment. The kind of judgment that didn't need proof or logic, just the assumption of guilt. Jalen Carter sat stiffly in a cold metal chair, his wrists and ankles shackled like he was some kind of monster. The bright orange jumpsuit felt like it was suffocating him, wrapping him in a label he didn't deserve. Criminal. He wasn't a criminal. He was a 15-year-old kid who had been walking home from the library, his only crime being black in the wrong place at the wrong time. But in this courtroom, none of that mattered. Jalen scanned the jury, searching for a single face that might see him as more than just another case file. Nothing. They avoided his gaze, unmoved, uninterested. The judge, an older white man with deep-set wrinkles and tired, indifferent eyes, barely acknowledged him before muttering, "Let's begin." This wasn't a trial. This was a performance, one where the ending had already been written. The prosecutor, Melissa Dorsey, stepped forward in her navy blue suit, her polished heels clicking against the floor as she addressed the jury. She moved with confidence, like she had already won. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not complicated." Her voice was sharp, rehearsed, every word carefully designed to sink into the jurors' minds. "We have security footage of a young black male in a dark hoodie near the scene of the crime." She paused, letting the words linger. "We have an experienced officer, Sergeant Bradley Grayson, who detained the suspect based on probable cause." Jalen felt his stomach tighten. Probable cause. That phrase had stolen days of his life. Dorsey turned slightly, pacing with measured steps. The suspect resisted arrest. That was a lie. He had no alibi. Also a lie. Jalen's fist clenched beneath the table. Every word she spoke felt like a hammer, nailing his fate shut. And his public defender? Mark Reynolds sat beside him like a ghost, flipping through his barely read notes, not objecting, not fighting, not caring. Jalen turned his head slightly toward him. "Are you going to say anything?" he whispered. Reynolds barely looked up. "Just let it play out," he muttered. Betrayal sliced through Jalen like a knife to the chest. Let it play out. He wanted to scream. Play out into what? A prison sentence. He was alone, and they all knew it. "Let's talk about the evidence," Dorsey continued. She turned toward the judge, nodding to the bailiff. "We will now present the security footage from the crime scene." The courtroom fell into silence as the grainy video appeared on the screen. Jalen leaned forward despite himself. This was it. The moment of truth. The video played. A figure in a dark hoodie moved quickly past the shattered window. Their face was completely hidden, but Jalen focused on something else. The height marker. Right next to the entrance. The suspect walked right past it. 5 feet 9 inches. Jalen's heart slammed against his ribs. That's not me. The realization hit him like a wave. He knew it wasn't him, but now he could prove it. The suspect was taller than him. Jalen's pulse pounded as he turned to Reynolds. "Did you see that? The suspect is taller than me. I'm 5 feet 4 inches. We can argue." Reynolds didn't even look at him. "It's not that simple." Jalen's chest burned with frustration. "What do you mean it's not that simple?" "That's proof." Before he could say another word, Dorsey spoke again. "As you can see, the suspect fits the description." Jalen's head snapped toward her. Did she just ignore what we all saw? He couldn't stay quiet. "That suspect is taller than me," Jalen blurted, his voice cutting through the silence. Dorsey turned slowly, her expression cool, calculated. "Height varies depending on camera angles." Jalen felt his stomach drop. Hoodies make it difficult to measure a person's exact height. No. They weren't going to admit it. They weren't going to let him go. Jalen's breath came faster, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "That's not how evidence works," he snapped, his voice shaking with disbelief. The judge sighed as if he was annoyed. "Mr. Carter, I will not tolerate outbursts in my courtroom." But enough. Enough. Like he was a child throwing a tantrum. Like his life wasn't on the line. Like they weren't ignoring the truth right in front of them. Jalen felt something crack inside him. He had been fighting for days. Fighting to be heard. Fighting to be seen. And they were still acting like he didn't matter. The rage burned through him like wildfire, but he forced himself to stay still. To breathe. This wasn't over. Jalen sat back, his mind racing, his heart thundering against his ribs. If logic wouldn't save him. If facts wouldn't save him. If the system was this determined to bury him. Then he had only one option left. He had to fight back. Not with rage, not with desperation, but with something they didn't expect from him. Strategy. Because if they wanted a battle, he was ready to give them one. But he had to play it right. Because the wrong move, and they would crush him completely. Jalen sat in his cell, staring at the cracked ceiling, his mind racing, his heart pounding. The courtroom had been a nightmare, a twisted stage where the truth didn't matter, where facts were twisted, and where people like him were already guilty before they even spoke. He had watched them bend reality, manipulate evidence, and ignore the most obvious proof that he wasn't the one in that video. They had taken everything from him. His freedom, his dignity, his voice. But they weren't taking his fight. If this system wanted him to stay silent, to take the plea, to accept defeat, then they had no idea who they were up against. Jalen knew he couldn't rely on anyone else. Not the lazy public defender, not the judge, not the so-called justice system. He was alone in this. But alone didn't mean powerless. If no one else was going to fight for him, then he'd fight for himself. So, he did the only thing he could. He prepared for war. Jalen spent every moment in that cold, suffocating cell reading, studying, memorizing. The juvenile detention center had a tiny, barely used library, its books worn and faded, but it had one section that mattered to him: law books. Criminal law. Cross-examination techniques. How to spot lies in a witness statement. Jalen read them all, taking notes on scraps of paper, writing down every weakness in the case against him. Every loophole, every flaw, every lie. And when the guards took his notes, he wrote them again from memory. If they wanted to keep him ignorant, then they had another thing coming. But knowledge wasn't enough. He needed to know how to use it. Jalen practiced his defense every night, whispering arguments to himself in the dark, memorizing the exact words he'd say when he got his chance. Some of the other inmates noticed. An older boy, Marcus, 17, and for a robbery he swore he didn't commit, leaned against the wall one night, watching Jalen pace his cell. "What are you doing, man?" Jalen didn't stop. "Practicing." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Jalen finally turned to face him, his eyes blazing with a fire that hadn't burned out yet. "For when I get my chance." Marcus stared at him for a long moment. Then, to Jalen's surprise, he nodded. "All right then," he said. "Let's make sure you don't mess it up." And just like that, Jalen had his first mock trial. Marcus and a few others played the prosecutor, the jury, the witnesses. Jalen stood his ground, cross-examined, poked holes in their arguments, refined his defense. They grilled him, challenged him, forced him to think faster, speak clearer. Until, eventually, he was ready. Until he wasn't just a scared kid anymore. He was a fighter. One night, while digging through a legal textbook, Jalen stumbled upon something that changed everything. A section on police misconduct. A section that talked about officers with patterns of wrongful arrests, excessive force, abuse of power. And that's when he remembered. Officer Bradley Grayson. The way he smirked when he arrested Jalen. The way he pinned him down, whispering threats. The way he seemed so sure Jalen would take the plea. Jalen searched for anything about Grayson. And then he found it. Multiple lawsuits. False arrests. Excessive force complaints. It wasn't just Jalen. Grayson had done this before, and he had gotten away with it. Until now. Jalen walked into court different this time. Not as a victim. Not as a kid waiting for the system to decide his fate. But as a fighter ready to tear their lies apart. The moment the judge called the trial to order, Jalen did something that shocked everyone. He stood. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear, strong, unwavering. "I'd like to question Sergeant Grayson myself." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. His public defender nearly fell out of his chair. "That's not how this works," Reynolds hissed. But Jalen didn't sit down. He looked straight at the judge. And for the first time, the judge actually looked at him. A long pause. Then, "Proceed." The prosecution looked stunned. Sergeant Grayson, sitting stiffly in his uniform, shifted in his seat. Jalen stepped forward. Calm. Focused. Ready. He locked eyes with Grayson and asked his first question. "Officer, how many times have you been accused of false arrests?" The room froze. Grayson blinked. "That's irrelevant," he muttered. "Answer the question," Jalen pressed, his voice sharper now. Grayson shifted. I don't recall." Jalen turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I have records of at least 5 lawsuits against Officer Grayson for wrongful arrests. Would you like me to read them?" The prosecutor shot up from her seat. "Objection. That has nothing to do with this case." Jalen's eyes burned into her. "It has everything to do with this case. Because this isn't about justice, it's about a cop who has been getting away with ruining innocent lives." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. The jury was listening now. The judge was listening now. Grayson's face turned red. "This is ridiculous." Grayson snapped. Jalen stepped closer. "Is it? Or are you just afraid they'll see the truth?" A heavy silence filled the room. The prosecutor looked panicked. The jury was shifting uncomfortably. For the first time since this nightmare started, Jalen was winning. The judge rubbed his temples. "This court will take a brief recess before continuing with deliberations," he announced. Jalen exhaled slowly, his pulse pounding. He turned toward the jury. They weren't looking at him like a criminal anymore. They were looking at him like a kid who had been wronged. And maybe, just maybe, they were ready to do something about it. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent. Every breath, every shift in a chair, every anxious glance from the jury to the judge felt heavier than the walls around them. Jalen sat stone still, hands clenched into fists beneath the table. This was it. Everything he had fought for, every long, sleepless night reading legal textbooks in a freezing jail cell, every humiliating moment in that orange jumpsuit, every second of being treated like less than human, it all came down to this moment. "Jury, have you reached a verdict?" The judge's voice rang through the room. A man in his 50s, wearing a dark suit and a nervous expression, stood slowly. The jury foreman. He held a slip of paper in his hands, his fingers trembling just slightly. "We have, Your Honor." Jalen felt his mother's presence behind him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. The bailiff walked over, took the paper, and handed it to the judge. Jalen's heart pounded against his ribs like a war drum. His entire life, his freedom, his future, his dignity hung on the next few words. The judge unfolded the paper. He read it carefully, then lifted his gaze. On the charge of burglary. A pause. A pause that lasted an eternity. "We find the defendant, Jalen Carter." Jalen held his breath. Not guilty. The world stopped. A gasp rippled through the crowd, a mix of relief, shock, and unspoken emotions that had been bottled up for too long. Jalen felt his chest loosen for the first time in days. His vision blurred as he exhaled, an overwhelming wave of relief washing over him. His mother let out a soft sob, one of gratitude, exhaustion, and pure heartbreak. He had won. But why did it feel so hollow? As the murmurs spread through the courtroom, the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "in light of new evidence regarding Sergeant Bradley Grayson's history of misconduct, this court recommends an internal investigation be launched into his past cases." Jalen turned just in time to see Grayson's face pale. The once smug officer, the man who had pinned him to the ground like an animal, who had whispered threats in his ear, who had tried to bury him alive in the system, was now the one under scrutiny. It wasn't enough. It wasn't prison. It wasn't justice for the other kids who had been railroaded by him. But it was a start. For the first time, Grayson wasn't untouchable. And that was something. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was waiting. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. A sea of people, some cheering, some outraged, some still processing the injustice that almost swallowed him whole, stood, watching. Jalen stepped toward the microphone. His mother stood beside him, proud but battle-worn. He gripped the podium, staring at the expectant faces before him. This was his moment. "I had to fight to prove my innocence," Jalen began, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. "But what about the kids who never get the chance?" The murmurs in the crowd grew quieter. How many innocent kids have taken a plea deal because they were too scared to fight? How many have spent months, years, locked up because no one believed them? Jalen's jaw tightened. I got lucky. But luck shouldn't decide who gets justice. His words hung in the air, heavy, unshakable. And then, slowly, the applause started. It built and built until it swallowed the street, the sound of a community that had seen too many stories like his. And for the first time, Jalen felt like he wasn't fighting alone. Jalen Carter walked out of the courthouse free, but he knew he wasn't truly free. Not yet. He still carried the weight of the kids who never got their day in court. The weight of a system that still saw black boys as threats before it saw them as children. The weight of knowing this could happen again, to someone else, to anyone, if nothing changed. The camera followed as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the city still moving around him like nothing had happened. But something had. And Jalen was going to make sure the world didn't forget it. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Jalen Carter's story is not just his own. It belongs to every person who has been judged before they could defend themselves. Every innocent life stolen by a system that never gave them a chance. He won his case, but how many others didn't? How many names never made the news? How many children sat in cold, dark cells, alone and afraid, because no one fought for them? Jalen didn't win because the system worked. He won because he fought back, because he refused to be silent, because he forced the world to see the truth. But it should never have come to that. Justice should not be a battle only the strongest can survive. So ask yourself, how many times has this happened? How many more will it take before things change? The reality is, this system was never built to protect everyone equally. It was built to favor some and discard others. And if we don't challenge it, if we don't stand up, speak out, and demand better, then it will continue to break lives without remorse. That's why Jalen's fight doesn't end with his freedom. It begins with his mission. Jalen is proof that knowledge is power, that understanding your rights can mean the difference between being swallowed by the system or breaking free from it. Imagine if every kid knew their rights before they were put in cuffs. Imagine if every child had someone willing to fight for them. The world would look a lot different. And that's why this message is bigger than just Jalen. It's about every person watching this video who believes that justice should not depend on luck or privilege. It's about the kids who need to hear this, the parents who need to teach it, and the communities who need to come together to protect their own. So, what can we do? Educate yourself. Know your rights. Understand the legal system, because knowledge is your first line of defense. Speak up. If you see injustice, don't look away. Share the stories, raise awareness, amplify the voices that need to be heard. Support those fighting for justice. Jalen fought for himself, but not everyone has that chance. Be the voice for those who don't have one. If you're watching this, you have the power to be part of the change. Like this video to stand with Jalen and everyone else who has been a victim of injustice. And don't stop here. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling these stories, exposing the truth, and fighting for a world where no one has to prove their innocence just because of the color of their skin. Because this isn't the last story. And together, we can make sure the next one has a different ending. Know your rights. Speak up. Fight back.